when a lonely little girl brought only bread and water from home for lunch. She never expected a millionaire to sit beside her in the school cafeteria. But what he did next left the entire school silent, and her life was never the same again. The lunch bell rang, and the school cafeteria filled with the sound of shuffling shoes, clattering trays, and the chatter of hundreds of children. Every table seemed to overflow with laughter, trading snacks, and friendly arguments about who was fastest in PE. But in the very far corner, where the sunlight didn't quite reach, sat 6-year-old Sarah Williams. She was so small that her legs dangled from the bench, gently swinging back and forth without touching the floor. The table she sat at seemed almost too big for her, as if it had been built for another world she didn't belong to. She pulled her lunchbox onto her lap. It was pink once, bright and cheerful, but now the paint was chipped, the edges scratched, and the clasp slightly bent. Inside lay only a small, dry slice of bread and a half-filled bottle of water. No colorful fruit, no warm food, no dessert wrapped in shiny foil. Sarah tore a tiny piece of bread, chewing slowly as if making it last would somehow fill her more. She kept her head down, pretending to be fascinated by the crumbs on the table. But the voices came anyway, sharp and loud enough to pierce through her quiet world. "Bread and water again?" It was a boy from the next table, his tone full of mocking surprise. "You're so poor, even the school mouse eats better than you." The laughter that followed was quick, cruel, and contagious. Sarah's hands trembled. She took another small bite, her lips pressed tight, trying to hide the fact that her eyes were stinging. Her gaze stayed locked on the table as if lifting her head might let the tears escape. She wished for something she didn't dare say out loud, that her mom could pack her something nice, or that the kids would just ignore her. But wishes, Sarah had learned, didn't often come true for people like her. Unseen by the children, outside the cafeteria's wide windows, a black luxury car sat parked near the school gates. Its glossy surface reflected the soft winter light, and beside it stood a tall man in a perfectly tailored charcoal suit. Jackson Reed, 33 years old, was not a man who usually went unnoticed. In the world of business, his name meant success, wealth, and influence. He had built his company from nothing, and his sharp mind and steady voice could silence boardrooms in seconds. But at that moment, he wasn't thinking about corporate deals or quarterly reports. His dark eyes were fixed on one thing, one small figure in the corner of the cafeteria. From where he stood, he could see her swinging legs, her tiny frame bent over a lunchbox, and the way she tore at her bread as if trying not to be seen. He could also see the other kids laughing, their careless cruelty like tiny arrows aimed at her. Something in his chest tightened. It wasn't pity. Jackson hated that word. It was something sharper, something that came from deep memory. He knew exactly what it was like to sit in that corner, to feel invisible and unwanted. Memories flickered in his mind, memories of his own childhood lunches, thin slices of bread, a reused bottle filled with tap water, and the laughter, always the laughter. He had promised himself long ago that if he ever made it in life, he'd never stand by while someone else went through the same pain. And right now, that promise was staring him in the face, in the form of a quiet little girl named Sarah Williams. Jackson's jaw tightened. This was not going to be just another lunch break. The hum of the cafeteria was like a steady roar, laughter, trays clattering, the squeak of sneakers on the polished floor. Teachers moved between tables, reminding kids to finish their meals and not throw food. Then the heavy double doors at the far end swung open. Jackson Reed stepped inside. His polished black shoes tapped softly but firmly against the tiles, a rhythm that seemed to cut through the noise. He carried no briefcase, no clipboard, just a quiet air of purpose. It wasn't every day a man in a perfectly tailored suit appeared in a school cafeteria. Conversations faltered. Forks froze halfway to mouths. Even the teachers exchanged surprised glances. Jackson didn't glance left or right. His eyes were locked on the smallest table in the far corner. Each step seemed deliberate, like he'd been walking toward this moment long before he entered the building. Sarah was still chewing her small piece of bread, pretending to focus on it, when a shadow fell over her table. She looked up and froze. The man standing in front of her seemed like he had stepped out of another world. Dark hair neatly combed, a warm but steady expression, and eyes that didn't look down at her like the others did. He crouched so they were eye to eye. His voice, low and calm, held none of the teasing she'd grown used to. "Hi," he said, as if they'd known each other for years. "I'm Jackson. Would you have lunch with me today?" Sarah blinked, unsure if she had heard him right. Her small fingers gripped the crust of her bread tighter. "I already have lunch," she said softly, her voice barely above a whisper. She lifted the slice almost apologetically as if to say she didn't need pity. Jackson's lips curved into a gentle smile, one that carried no trace of judgment. "That's okay," he replied. "I know a place nearby. How about we go together?" Sarah's heart thumped. No one had ever invited her to lunch before, not like this. She glanced around. Dozens of eyes were staring, some wide with shock, others narrowing in confusion. The kids who had laughed earlier now sat frozen, as if their words had been stolen away. Jackson stood and extended his hand. There was no rush in his gesture, only a quiet certainty that she could trust it. Sarah hesitated. Her father had taught her not to follow strangers, but something in Jackson's gaze told her he wasn't a stranger. He was someone who had been where she was. Slowly, she placed her tiny hand in his. The warmth of his palm swallowed hers, and for the first time that day, she didn't feel small. Without another word to anyone in the room, Jackson began to walk toward the doors. The clicking of his shoes was now the only sound. Every student's jaw dropped, their necks craning to follow them as they passed. A teacher stepped forward as if to ask where they were going, but Jackson gave a reassuring nod, one that seemed to silence the question before it left her lips. The double doors opened, letting in the crisp air from outside. Sarah looked back just once, catching sight of the stunned faces still frozen in mid-bite. Then the doors closed behind them, shutting away the cafeteria's noise. Jackson didn't let go of her hand. Across the street, the smell of fresh bread and coffee drifted from a small, cozy cafe with golden light spilling through its windows. Sarah had walked past it countless times, but had never stepped inside. Today she would. And it was Jackson Reed, Millionaire CEO, stranger-turned-ally, who was taking her there. The moment Sarah stepped inside the cafe, she felt like she had entered another world. It was warm and inviting, with golden light spilling over polished wooden tables. The smell of fresh bread, creamy butter, and simmering soup wrapped around her like a blanket. She stopped just inside the doorway, her eyes darting across the room. There were shelves lined with jars of jam, baskets of rolls still steaming from the oven, and a display case filled with cakes so pretty they almost didn't look real. Jackson noticed her hesitation. With a reassuring smile, he guided her to a corner table by the window. He pulled out a chair for her as if she were the most important guest in the room. Sarah climbed up carefully, her feet not quite reaching the floor. She placed her old lunchbox on the chair beside her, almost like it was a little friend that had come along too. Jackson slid a large menu toward her. She stared at it as if it were made of gold. There were so many words, so many pictures, grilled sandwiches stacked high, bowls of soup with steam curling upward, pasta covered in creamy sauces. "You can order anything you want," Jackson said warmly. Sarah's head snapped up. "Anything?" she asked, her eyes wide, as if she needed to make sure she'd heard correctly. "Anything," he confirmed, leaning slightly forward as if letting her in on a secret. Her gaze darted across the pictures again, but one caught her eye. A perfectly toasted grilled cheese sandwich, the melted cheddar oozing at the edges, sitting beside a bowl of bright red tomato soup. She pointed to it shyly. "That one." Jackson gave a nod to the waiter, who smiled at Sarah like she had just made the perfect choice. While they waited, Sarah's fingers drummed softly on the table, her eyes sneaking glances at the people around them. No one was laughing at her here. No one was whispering behind their hands. When the food finally arrived, Sarah's breath caught. The plate was warm, the golden bread crisp at the edges, the cheese inside glowing like sunshine. Beside it, the soup shimmered in its white bowl, giving off the rich scent of tomatoes and herbs. Her small hands hovered over the plate, almost afraid to touch it, as though if she moved too quickly, it might disappear. "You can eat, sweetheart," Jackson said softly, his voice kind but steady. It was the first time in a long time someone had called her something gentle. Sarah picked up half of the sandwich. The first bite was small, cautious, and then her eyes lit up. "This," she whispered between chews, "this is the best lunch I've ever had." Jackson's chest tightened at her words. He smiled, but inside he felt something heavier, a mix of gratitude and anger. Gratitude that he could give her this moment. Anger that such a simple thing could be the best she'd ever known. For Sarah, the cafe wasn't just a place to eat. It was a place where she finally felt like she belonged, even if just for a little while. And for Jackson, this wasn't just a lunch. It was the beginning of something he knew he couldn't walk away from. The cafe felt quieter now, almost as if the rest of the world had stepped aside to let this moment happen. Sarah's plate was half empty, the edges of the sandwich crust scattered like little breadcrumbs across the table. Her soup bowl still gave off a gentle steam, curling upward in slow ribbons. Jackson leaned back slightly, studying her small, thoughtful face. She was chewing slowly, savoring every bite as if she were storing the memory in her heart. Something about her quiet nature reminded him of himself, not the man he was now, but the boy he once had been. He set his coffee cup down, fingers brushing the rim, and said in a low, steady voice, "Sarah, can I tell you a secret?" Her big blue eyes lifted to his. "A secret?" He nodded. "One I don't tell many people." She leaned forward, elbows on the table like a little detective about to uncover a mystery. "When I was your age," Jackson began, "I ate bread and water, too." Sarah blinked. "You did?" "Yes." He glanced out the window briefly, as though seeing another time entirely. "My mom couldn't afford much. Some days that was all we had. Kids at school laughed at me, just like they laughed at you." Sarah's gaze dropped to her plate. "That's not nice." "No," Jackson agreed quietly. "It's not, and it hurt. A lot more than I let anyone see." He paused, letting the weight of the memory settle between them. Then he smiled. Not the smile of a businessman sealing a deal, but the smile of someone who had survived something and learned from it. "But I made myself a promise. I told myself that when I grew up, I'd never let anyone feel that alone if I could help it." Sarah tilted her head, her small fingers tracing the edge of her soup bowl. "So, you're helping me now?" she asked softly. "Yes," Jackson said, his voice gentle but sure. "And one day, you'll help someone else. Someone smaller or younger or just someone who needs to know they're not invisible." Sarah's little shoulders straightened as if she were suddenly taller. It wasn't just a conversation anymore. It felt like he had passed her something precious, something she had to take care of. She nodded slowly, seriously, as though she were taking an oath. "I will," she whispered, "I promise." Jackson's eyes softened. In that moment, it didn't matter that she was 6 years old or that her lunch had been bread and water. What mattered was that she understood, really understood, that kindness had a way of traveling from one person to another, changing the story for both. For Jackson, sharing this secret wasn't about pity or charity. It was about letting Sarah know that even the most successful people had once felt small and unseen, and that what you carry in your heart matters far more than what you carry in your lunchbox. The winter air was crisp as they stepped out of the cafe, Sarah clutching her small paper bag with the last half of her grilled cheese tucked inside. She wanted to save it, maybe for dinner, maybe to share with her dad. Jackson walked beside her in silence for a moment, his long coat swaying gently with each step. There was something about the way he slowed his pace to match hers that made her feel seen. Not rushed, not brushed aside, just important enough to take the time. They reached the edge of the schoolyard. Children ran past them, laughing and chasing each other before the bell rang. Sarah glanced at them, her shoulders curling inward. She was used to watching from the sidelines, not joining in. Jackson noticed. He placed a gentle hand on her shoulder. "Sarah," he said softly. She looked up. He knelt down so his eyes were level with hers. From his pocket, he pulled out a small, cream-colored envelope. Her brows knit together. "What's this?" she asked, her voice barely more than a whisper. "Something for you," he replied, offering it like it was something fragile, something precious. She took it carefully, sliding a small finger under the flap. Inside was a gift card to the very cafe they had just visited. Her eyes widened. For me? Yes, anytime you feel like having lunch there, you can. But I don't... She stopped herself, biting her lip as if afraid to admit she didn't think she deserved it. Jackson smiled, warm, patient, almost fatherly. You don't have to explain. This is for when you need a reminder that you matter, that you deserve kindness. Her gaze fell on the folded note tucked inside. She opened it, reading the neat handwriting slowly. Never be ashamed of what you have. It's just the first chapter of your story. Jackson. Her throat tightened. She clutched the note against her chest as if afraid it might blow away. Thank you, she whispered, her voice trembling. Jackson nodded, but there was something in his eyes, a quiet determination, that Sarah didn't understand yet. What she didn't know was that Jackson had stayed behind at the cafe for a few extra minutes before catching up with her. He had made a discreet phone call to her school principal. Inside the principal's office later that afternoon, Jackson had spoken with calm authority, but his tone carried a deep compassion. Sarah's father has been looking for work, hasn't he? He asked. Yes, the principal confirmed, sighing. It's been a struggle for him. I own several companies, Jackson said. One of them has an opening that matches his skills perfectly. I'd like to arrange an interview, discreetly. No pressure, but I think he's more than capable. The principal smiled, relief flickering across his face. That would mean the world to them. And so, while Sarah stood in the cold, holding her gift card and note, feeling like maybe, just maybe, she wasn't invisible anymore, her life was already beginning to change in ways she couldn't imagine. Jackson straightened, giving her shoulder one last squeeze. Remember, this is just your first chapter, Sarah. The rest, well, it's going to be something beautiful. She didn't know why, but she believed him. As she turned to walk into school, the envelope safely tucked into her coat pocket, the cold didn't feel so sharp anymore. Somewhere deep inside, a small, warm light began to glow, faint but real. And for the first time in a long time, Sarah allowed herself to hope. The very next day, Sarah stepped into the school cafeteria. Her steps were slower this time, but her head was a little higher. In her hands, she carried a brand new lunchbox. When she opened it, there were fresh sandwiches, fruit, and a juice box. The same kids who had laughed yesterday went quiet. Some of them stared at the food, but most stared at her. Sarah didn't sit in the corner today. She walked to her usual table and set her lunch down with calm hands. A group of girls whispered to each other, not as loud as before. Two boys who had laughed yesterday looked away. Then one of them slowly stood up. He walked over, his face red, his shoes scuffing the floor. I'm sorry for laughing, he mumbled. Sarah looked at him for a moment, then gave a small smile. It's okay, she said softly. And somehow it sounded like she really meant it. After school that week, Sarah ran home with excitement. Her father was standing in the living room, holding a piece of paper. He had tears in his eyes, but this time they were happy tears. I got the job, Sarah, he whispered, his voice shaking. Before she could say anything, he scooped her up in his arms. She laughed and hugged him tightly, her heart bursting with joy. Far away, Jackson smiled when he got the call confirming the hire. He didn't tell Sarah right away. It wasn't about the credit. A few days later, Jackson visited the school again. The students gathered in the assembly hall, curious. He stood in front of them, no suit jacket this time, just a simple shirt. His voice was calm, but it carried across the room. Don't judge someone by their lunch, he began. Don't judge them by their clothes or by where they come from. You never know the battles they're fighting, he continued, or the greatness they're carrying inside. Every word sank into the quiet room. Some kids shifted uncomfortably, remembering yesterday. Sarah sat in the front row, listening with shining eyes. She didn't feel small anymore. She felt strong. From that day on, things began to change. Kids who used to laugh started sitting with her at lunch. She shared her snacks without pride, without shame. She started helping others who sat alone, just like she once did. Her laughter began to fill the room in a way it never had before. The corner table stayed empty. No one had to hide there anymore. Jackson still visited from time to time, not as a millionaire, but as a friend. And whenever people asked him why, he would just say, because kindness is richer than money. Sarah never forgot the day he took her to lunch. She never forgot the words he wrote in that note. One day she would pass them on to someone else, because the only true currency in life is respect.